back to Brand Bridge. We are here with Gillian Daines, the Global Head of Corporate Communications for OCI Global. And also I have Adam Conker and Rhiannon Lowe with me from RBL. All right, so Gillian, can you tell us a little bit about when you decided to do a rebrand? What led up to that at OCI?
The company had decided to try and decarbonise its production processes for the first time, and that is an absolutely monumental ambition. But it meant that it was really important, therefore, for the company to try and reach out to new audiences, to directly to customers, to policymakers who could help them on that decarbonisation journey, to investors, and also to their own employees to bring them on that journey with them. And so at that time, it seemed really appropriate to have a fresh look at the way the company was perceived, think about its reputation, and think about actually changing the way that it communicated what it was doing as a business. And so for OCI, this was really about almost like a ground zero in terms of communications and starting completely afresh. So looking at the brand as the starting point for that seemed like a really sensible thing to do.
Right. And now how do you build that into your brand? And so what was the next step from there?
The chemicals business is a dirty business in terms of how it traditionally worked in terms of fossil fuels production. And so grounding this in a completely realistic, transparent way was really important. The last thing we wanted to do is say everything's going to be green, you know, by next year. That was never going to be the case. It's always going to be a long-term transition. And so for people to understand that and understand that that could be done in a sensible and crucially, like a financially viable way for the business to keep producing and gradually decarbonise was something we really had to consider. And so that came from the leadership down. It was their vision from the executive team. So the starting point was talking to them. And then it was starting to think about how we could communicate that via our strengths throughout the business. So through the people who were talking to customers, who were talking to the politicians and delivering that message on the ground. So it really started with the people.
One of the things that you mentioned that you were at ground zero for the transition and as a business, but it also coming in, it felt like you were at ground zero for brand.
Oh yeah.
And
sure.
I just wonder, like both of those things going hand in hand, how much do you think that's replicated across the industry as well?
When we looked at our peers and our competitors, everyone else was kind of in the same boat. Now, that presented quite an interesting challenge. We had the benefit of not trying to necessarily change the way we perceived. It was more that no one had ever heard of us or most of our competitors, really. It was more a case of starting to develop that industry as something that could be an exciting opportunity for the energy transition for the first time.
So that double header of ground zero for the transition and ground zero for brand, how was that received internally when you started to talk about it, and how did one impact the other?
There was an exciting blank sheet where we could really decide. We didn't feel that there was anyone in our sector that was really ahead of the game here. So that was an opportunity for OCI, and that made our leadership very excited. We could be the ones who are leading in that space and starting to talk about the unique opportunities of our products in that space. And that led to a lot of excitement. I mean, it also meant that everything was on the table. And so there were a lot of ideas to filter down and narrow down. But it made it an exciting opportunity, I think. Happily, last year at COP28, we saw more ambition towards phasing out of fossil fuels. That change is coming, it is happening. So to be at the forefront of that, to be a company who's already said, well, we've already taken those first steps. We've already started to transition slowly, maybe test the waters, see how things happen in a technical perspective, to see how we can make those products work, to even test things like performance. That's not so relevant to our products, but that would be the case in other industries. To start to show that you have demonstrated that before you have to puts you in a leading position there.
Jill, you talked about the opportunity of being a brand that's on the front foot, that is leading the way, if you like. And when we started this work with you, we also felt it was a brief of huge opportunity. It's what struck us, that the brand had the power to unlock that opportunity. Could you talk to us a little bit more about some of those opportunities that you felt that the brand was going to help unlock for you?
I mean, I think apart from the commercial opportunities, which were obviously sort of at the forefront of our minds, another really interesting one was around talent. So a real challenge that any industrial manufacturing company has, I think, is attracting the very brightest and best talent. And you mentioned, Jack, earlier, big brand names, people like Shell or Exxon, for example, people who live in communities where that oil and gas industry has been huge for decades, have heard of those companies, they know the benefits they offer, they know the kind of career trajectory that they can offer. And so when you get a smaller to medium-sized business that people might not be so familiar with, how can you get an advantage to get the brightest and best talent into your company? And being able to effectively communicate your sustainability goals is a really good way of doing it.
Yeah.
Most young people coming out of university or college or looking for apprenticeship these days, that is something that is actually really near the top of the list. For some people, the top of their list, depending on the industry that they're looking at. And so that's something that has actually been very effective for OCI, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of actually in terms of the outcomes, is how the brand has helped us to communicate to our own employees and indeed attract new employees, because we've been able to communicate that sustainability goal effectively, and people feel like they're then part of something not only that's moving forward in a positive way for the planet, but also that they're working in an industry that's progressive and future facing, and it's not going to be something that's going to be phased out.
Right. We've been doing a campaign which we're terming cleaner industry, and it generally refers to manufacturing companies, chemical companies, energy companies, just to try to gauge how they're feeling about greenwashing and how concerned they are that they could be accused of potentially doing that. And then according to the responses that we've gotten, 70% of people working in communications, marketing, and sustainability within those organizations feel like they could be potentially accused of greenwashing. So I was just going to ask, from your background and from your work at OCI, how do you navigate that concern?
People are very afraid of greenwashing. You always hear it from leadership teams. It is actually fairly easy to stay within the lines, in my opinion, if you follow really sensible guidance. If you're in the UK, the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, has really great guidance. They have a little thing called the Green Claims Code, and then they have some sort of more substantial guidance to back that up, which I'd recommend to anyone who's sort of looking for some clear guidance on that basis. But it's common sense stuff. It's, stay within your lane, talk about your own products and your own business. Don't start talking about other people and what's going on elsewhere, because you might not always have the latest information about that. You can have the latest information about your own business. The other thing that I think companies are concerned about, and right to be so, is this thing of how influencers can understand what you're doing. So I mentioned before that I've had the challenge of trying to explain something to a journalist and feeling frustrated because I feel like what I'm saying to them is very clear and they're just not getting it.
Yeah.
And I know they're going to write a story and I'm thinking, well, have they understood what I've said? Are they going to misconstrue this? Are they going to take it out of context? And that's a real problem, to be honest. In the energy transition world, things are moving so quickly that many people in the media, that it's hard for them to keep up on the detail of what's happening in certain industries. So being really open and transparent with your kind of public facing information that you have on your website, your reporting, like your ESG report or your annual report, things like that are really important, because you can then always direct people towards that really robust evidence-based information to try and keep things moving. But I mean, I understand those fears, but I also, to sort of go back to the first part of your question, think we can't then fall down the trap of greenhushing instead and not saying anything, because, well, for one, I'm not going to name any names, but there are a couple of examples I can think of where huge multinational companies have been accused of greenwashing, possibly legitimately, because they may have overclaimed. But from what I know about their sector, they are not the least active people in their sector on sustainability. So they may have overclaimed, but they'll be doing some work. There might be other people in that sector who are doing nothing, therefore saying nothing, and no one's noticing them and no one's picking up on it. And that is something that I think, looking at the environmental community, I would like to see more journalists looking into those companies who are saying nothing at all. We don't want to create the kind of vacuum where, from a consumer perspective or a policymaker perspective, you can't tell what's going on. Where people are making genuine progress, they shouldn't be afraid to communicate it.
And I think what was really interesting for us from a brand perspective working together as a team was making sure that we shaped something that had real authenticity at the heart, but also reflected the action that you're talking about. So, OCI, we're a business that is driving change. It isn't necessarily getting to the perfect solution right now, but taking the steps to move things on. And we wanted to make sure that, the brand really reflected that. And I think we felt that in our initial conversations together. How do we make sure that we develop something that feels true to a brand that's driving change, that's driving action, and isn't necessarily afraid to lay out what it's doing? And my second point was around authenticity. I think we worked really, really hard to get under the skin of how the business is driving change, listening to the people that matter, that are essentially doing those different pieces of work, understanding what was true to the organisation. So therefore the brand that we're creating together told that story with authenticity, with power, with impact.
I agree, and I think one of my favourite bits of it was our strapline that we ended up with, which was powering a cleaner future sooner. And that has really helped us to articulate our messaging, because the powering bit we liked because we were starting to move into fuels and transport and energy, as well as our traditional industries such as industrial application and fertilizers. So the powering bit was nice. But cleaner future sooner, we never claimed that anything we were going to do was going to be 100% clean, because the nature of the business means it can't be realistically. But cleaner, better, more sustainable.
Yep.
This is what we're aiming towards. And sooner, we want to accelerate that change. We want to be at the forefront. We want to be in leadership of it, but it's not there yet. So it's still a future ambition. So that felt very reflective of what you were saying, Ree, in terms of it can be ambitious, but it's got to be realistic as well.
So what I really liked a couple of things that come together there, which was you were talking about a real common sense solution, and you were talking about authenticity, and the kind of the things that we liked about you as an organization was the practicality of it all. And that felt like that needed to come out in the communications, because of what you're saying about there being a need for an education piece, right? So perfection being the enemy of good. It feels like one of the big issues with greenwashing is people not yet really getting their heads around what the road to net zero looks like, what green is. And it's only by getting across those things and getting back to the practical steps, why this is better than what came before, that you can start to move forward, right? You have to help people understand where you are in the journey, or help us all understand where we are in the journey.
100%. And I think in the time that I've been doing communications on this topic at OCI, but I've had it in previous roles as well, like talking to people and taking them on that journey, you do start to see that light bulb moment where they're like, oh, okay, I thought the solution was this, but I can see how that might not be available for another 10 years. So what are we doing in the meantime? And as you say, making, perfect not to be the enemy of good. Like, we have to keep making progress. And unfortunately, we haven't made progress quickly enough on a global level. So anything we can do now to start chipping away at stuff has to be seen as a positive thing.
And so there's the progress point, but then there's also understanding what green is at the fundamental level, because we're talking a lot about decarbonisation, and when we were doing the research, lots of people understand decarbonisation as energy. They don't then think of it as raw materials and ingredients and manufacturing processes and everything else. And you having to help them understand where you fit into everything, right? That's kind of a big job in itself.
It is. And I think this is something that we found talking to a lot of customers, and, going back to the point of why have some brands communicated better on the energy transition than others? If you are an industrial brand, it's a very complex system in order to decarbonise. You've got to look at your raw materials, you've got to look at your scope one, your own production, you've got to look at things like transport, you've got to look at things like waste, you've got to look at like the end use of your product. There's so many parts to it, and people don't necessarily understand that. And actually, if you can shift the gear on one or two of those things faster than the others, that's probably the right thing to do, but that might be a difficult message to communicate. So I think, it's getting around some of those things and getting people to understand. But I do genuinely think the public as a whole, but also, thankfully, I think policymakers and people like that are starting to become a little bit better informed about this. So we can now start to share more complex messages.
So you've got to get you. So now we can start to address those second layer issues of what's going on behind the scenes, right? Once people now got more of the big picture, we can start to like move into some of the next stuff. And that makes me think about going back to our stats. So that 70% of people feeling greenwashing anxiety, how much of that do you think is them worrying about what other people know and don't know?
I think that there is a worry about trying to communicate something in a simple, concise, and dare I say, kind of marketing way that doesn't then undermine the overall message. It is actually very difficult sometimes to get these kind of environmental claims across in an accurate way.
Yeah.
Without losing any sense of punch or kind of understanding that's going to come across to the consumer. And so that's always going to be a challenge. And I think it's something that you have to have your brand and communications teams, your sustainability teams, and your legal and compliance teams all working on this together. If you can get your brand guys to sign off some language that the legal people agree with, you probably hit the spot.
That understanding internally as well. So let's talk a little bit about that, because when we dive into the research, there's a bit of a hint there that people are personally more worried about greenwashing and more worried about their progress than their organisation is, and it's almost like they're acting as a bit of a drag on the organisation, right? Because then they're not confident enough to put forward the company messages. So how much of your job has been through this rebrand then has been that internal education piece and getting people up to speed, and what difference does it make if you can achieve that?
I think it makes a big difference if you can get people to feel confident. So, for example, I think in any business, if you can get your people on the ground to go out and speak at events, to feel confident talking to people in networking scenarios, even talking to customers confidently about these things, knowing that what they say is true, it's accurate, is the latest information. If they have a question, they know what their source information is and what they can refer to. That's really going to help your business seem credible. And so I think it's incredibly important. And what we've tried to help people do internally within the business is to look at some of those guidelines that we were talking about. If people think about what it is they want to say, check it against that guidance and think, well, yes, is this the latest information? Is it accurate? Like, am I bringing in any external evidence? If yes, do I trust it? Where did it come from? They can go through that checklist, then they feel confident in what they say. And so that is what I would advise people to do. Think about what you want to say, top level. This is my dream thing that I want to say. Go through the checklist and then start to chip away at it and question it. And then, definitely, genuinely talk to legal teams and make sure that they're then comfortable with that claim, because if they're comfortable with it, it's probably pretty watertight.
Yeah.
But I think at a high level, having that kind of shared sense of purpose, that vision, that story is almost the first step in helping people to feel like they're all pointing in the right direction. And then after that, of course, it's kind of the practical guidance and the specifics that they need to work through to make sure they're sort of on point and the message is correct. But I think going about it so that it feels like an organisation-wide endeavour, and each person has a role to play in hitting that ambition, the direction that the organisation is going in, is really important. And I think one of the really interesting things about OCI was when we started to work on the brand project together, actually the organisation was sort of many organisations all together, and actually working to create that shared narrative, as we've just talked about, those shared objectives, if you like, bringing the organisation together into one unified, moving towards in the same direction organisation was really critical. And it gave everyone a shared sense of purpose, as I said, but it talked about how all of the different parts of the business laddered up to one whole. And I think that helps also from a greenwashing, greenhushing perspective, because actually it's clear how all of the different pieces of the puzzle come together to legitimately say this is how we're driving change, and that was really important.
And in that sense, how closely do you think the brand strategy and the organizational strategy have to sit? What relationship do they have between each other?
Well, yeah, they have to be aligned. I mean, that's where the brand strategy, from my perspective, that's where it has to start. So in any brand strategy that I've ever worked on in the past, that's your first question is, well, what's your business strategy? What are you trying to achieve as a business? Because not only does that help you set your vision and your mission, which is part of your brand, but it's also starting to answer the questions of, well, what is this brand trying to achieve for us if you don't know what the goals of the business are, then you can't really answer that part either. If the goal of the business, for example, is to grow, well, then you're going to need more people, for example. You might be needing to branch out into other countries, into places and markets that you've not been before. So all of that stuff will then go into your brand strategy. And if you don't know about that to begin with, then you're not going to go in the right direction. So I don't think you can separate them at all.
And it feels like it's almost, particularly in sectors where you are pivoting, right? Which you've said there are a lot of companies pivoting at the moment. In fact, all of them are going to need to at some point. It feels like if there's quite a large change in organizational strategy, then the brand strategy's got a big role to do in helping people to understand what that shift is and why you're making it. Really importantly, why you're making it as well. Not just be able to talk about it, but understand, I should be on board with this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think often what happens within a company is you set your business strategy. Of course, that's set at the board and the executive level. And the language that's used around that and the way that's being talked about is for those people at that level who need that level of detail and of the plan. When you're then going down to an employee level and getting someone to feel inspired by it or think, well, what's my role to play? How will this affect my job? How does this affect whether this is the kind of company I want to work for? All those questions, that has to be done in a different way, because that initial top line strategy won't be geared at the individual. It's obviously much more high level than that. So those messages then, of course, have to be repurposed for those people. And then when you look at your other audiences, again, your customer is thinking, well, how does this benefit me? So all of that stuff has to be messaged differently.
And what's one of the things that's interesting in organisations like yours, I'm also thinking, we work with another organisation who is incredibly green, sustainable, but you probably from the outside wouldn't think it. So they work in plastic packaging, right? But the difference that they make when they actually talk you through how far they're getting us down the roadmap to net zero is incredible. But where I was going with that is, so you've got people in your industry and they have people in their industry who are, when we say we've got to get the people on board, often I think that brings to mind like either people in a cubicle or people in a factory turning a dial or whatever. But these are actually like, they might have worked in that industry for 20, 30 years, be real leaders in their field, really know it inside out. And suddenly you've got to get them to, yes, they're still going to be doing the same thing, but they've got to think about it in a different way. And that feels like that's a whole different challenge to what might come to mind when people think, we've got to get the people on board.
Yeah, that's true. And I think in those sorts of industries, so the company that you were just talking about and the same in the industry that OCI is in, you have extremely intelligent people working in engineering, in sort of complex manufacturing knowledge, operational, things like site development. As you say, they're absolute experts in that field, but they have had to start to think about their jobs in a completely new way. My experience, thankfully, is that people find that really exciting. And I think it goes back a little bit to what I was saying before, that if you work in an industry, plastic packaging, I think, is a good example, that if you've been working in that industry for 20 years, you might have been worried, well, where is this going? Where is my knowledge going to go if we're being told to use less and less packaging? But actually, if where my knowledge can go is a way to make that more sustainable, so that actually I could still have my job, it just means that I have to change the way that this is done, that's an exciting opportunity for people. And it means that those skills remain relevant. And I think that's the way, but that's a good example of how you kind of present that messaging to someone. That's not something that would have necessarily been in the top line of the business strategy, but when you're talking to an employee saying your skills are still relevant, and actually they're more relevant than ever, you have the opportunity to be part of this new change, this new direction for the industry. I think potentially is very exciting for people. It's not to say it's easy though, like some people do struggle with it.
And what I love about that, about making it exciting, right, is it comes back to that our top line stat, 70% worried about greenwashing. So you're going to remove a lot of that worry if you get people excited about something. And part of that, and you also said, that they're shifting from being part of that old industry to something new. They haven't actually changed industry, they're still in the same job. But it comes back to the education piece of people feeling like they're either part of the problem or part of the solution. Well, actually, there's a massive grey area in the middle, and we've all got to figure out our roles in there, and helping people feel excited about navigating that. Again, what an opportunity, but also kind of a challenge at the same time.
That's true. And to be honest, for me personally, that is the kind of business I've always enjoyed working for most. I've worked for several businesses where I would say they have that kind of challenging role where the traditional way of doing the industry hasn't always been the most environmentally positive, but and will always be challenging to do in an environmentally sustainable way. But if you're trying to make that change, if you're trying to make that transition, then you're actually making a really big impact. Yeah. And I think that's much more interesting. I find that much more interesting pub chat than if I was just working for, a brand that had always been green from the get-go, for example. Like, I think it's much more interesting to try and challenge people's perceptions and say, well, you may not know this.
Yeah.
Right.
And it comes back to what we were talking about in terms of storytelling. You know, brands that tell stories and that go out there and confidently talk about what they're doing are the ones that are cutting through, that are making the difference. Something I think that's really fascinating that I was reading about the other day, perception that B2B branding is not sophisticated, is not at the level of B2C, and that is not thought about in the same way. And it's just totally mad. You know, there's so much complexity, but there's so much sophistication there has to be in order to tell these types of stories and to create brands that are, you know, as I said, cutting through, that are leading the change.
And I think that's because people think about brands as being a consumer-facing thing. I think when a lot of people think about brand, they think about the name of the company, they think about the logo, and then they think about a flashy ad, probably. And actually, if you're a B2B brand, you will obviously have a company name, probably a logo, but you're going to communicate that in a completely different way. So actually, the top point of your brand could be aimed at politicians. It could be all about advocacy. And so it would be a completely different style and a way of doing things, but it doesn't mean that you don't need a consistent vision and mission and strategy and way of communicating. And frankly, if people can't see when they go to your website or look at your social media channels or pick up and read a paragraph about you in the media, if they can't get who you are by doing that, then there's a problem. So B2B brands need it just as much as B2C.
No, and what I found really interesting about that, thinking back to our experience with OCI, was that, there was a few stages to it. One, when we first started the project, it was like panic. It was like, oh my God, we've suddenly got to understand all of the the methanol production process and sustainable methanol versus non-sustainable methanol, et cetera, et cetera. And then we reached a point about a month in when we went, no. So, and that is part of the challenge, right? All my team are now chemists. But then the bigger challenge was actually like about halfway through, we went, whoa, we've got to throw all this away. We struggled to realize that we had to just get rid of all the detail. So and if that was hard for us, I can't imagine how hard it must be for the people who live and breathe it day in, day out, or have done for 20 years to suddenly realize I've got to go up. It
is a tough challenge, I imagine, making ammonia and methanol production engaging to a wider audience. How do you go about doing that, Jill?
And I think it goes back to what you were saying about B2B brands. The answer is, how does it apply to the end audience and what they want to do? So what we did with the OCI brand process is we, as you said, started to think less about the weeds of how we produce things to a certain extent, and more about, well, what's the outcome? And the outcome is, for example, you could produce cleaner fuels for shipping, you could produce cleaner energy solutions, you could produce lower carbon fertilizers, you could produce lower carbon ingredients that go into industrial production. So the outcome is that this table might be made with lower carbon ammonia as part of its make, or something like that.
And if you're able to talk about outcomes, then you start to talk about impact. And if you can start to talk about impact, then when we think about greenwashing and greenhushing and all the challenges around that, actually, I think you go quite far from removing some of those barriers and those challenges, because you are demonstrating impact. It goes back to the point about action, even if it's small steps. So I think it's a really interesting lens to be looking at things. It's about outcomes and impact, less about those inputs.
Yeah.
And that goes back a bit to kind of where we are in the conversation and the awareness raising job that's got to be done, right? So one of the we've talked about how it's complex and it's grey, and it's not just as simple as this is green and this isn't green, and how we've got to tell the story of different types of sustainability. But the problem is we keep doing all of that, and then the first thing we'll do is slap a wind turbine on the cover of something. It's not all about wind turbines, but here's a wind turbine.
Yeah.
And how, so finding the ways to demonstrate impact and outcome rather than input and turbine is one of the big challenges, and that's one of the challenges that all organisations have got to face, right?
Yeah.
It's true, sometimes trying to visualise what you mean by some kind of sustainable production can be so difficult. I mean, we're literally talking about gases in terms of water, so you can't see them at all. And one of the more sustainable ways that we make methanol, for example, is by using landfill and capturing the methane. I mean, it's good. It's good technology. It's not beautiful. So, you know, the temptation to use the wind turbine when actually the reality would be the landfill. It's stuff like that that makes it challenging. But that's why what I liked about one of the things that we did with the OCI brand that was really successful is we put people at the forefront. So we didn't shy away from, you know, looking at some of that production stuff, but we put our people within the business at the forefront of it, so that if you were showing a cooling tower or something quite industrial, that we always had, and they were the real people who were working there in it and making them the heroes of the story.
And I think that's one of the big successes of that project, was connecting people with production, if you like, because it wasn't being done. And I think there are lots and lots of organisations out there working in similar industries that are very industrial focused, that don't connect their people, but actually, of course, it's the people that make everything happen.
Yeah.
You can have all the best tech in the world, but if it's not run or led or developed by people, it's not going to do anything. So I think making sure that people are intrinsically part of your story is a really, really strong way to help to move you forward.
Yeah, agree.
Jill, do you have any advice for someone who's thinking about starting off on a branding journey?
Yes, I think the first thing you should do is ensure that your leadership team are on board. Don't ever start this without getting the support of your CEO and other people within the executive and the board. Make sure they all want to do it. And then once that has been established, have a serious conversation with that leadership team about the vision that they want to create and what they want to do. That has to be your starting point. If you know that everyone is aligned with wanting to do the project and that there's a shared vision that you feel, yes, okay, this is different enough, it's creating that shift that's going to justify the branding project that I want to take, that you can move it forward. Of course, I would recommend that they speak to an expert, someone like RBL or another branding agency, and ideally probably talk to a handful so that you can get different perspectives on how you might perceive the challenge. But whilst you use those experts to help steer you in the right direction, because you know they've done dozens and dozens of brand strategy, you and your company and your leadership have to be the one who steer that vision. And you have to keep going back to that initial conversation you had. Doesn't mean it won't evolve and it won't change as you go through the process, but keep going back to that initial conversation around what's our business strategy, what's our vision, how is our brand going to help us achieve that, and keep returning to that as you go through the process and making sure you're staying true to that sort of North Star. That's the most important thing. I think if you do that, then you can't go too far wrong.
Great. Thanks, Jill. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much.